My favorite analogies that Dr. Tony Weiner uses, he calls it the Nana's meatballs problem. If Nana forgets how to make the meatballs that she's been making for 50 years and she can't make the meatballs anymore, that's a problem.
Hi, this is Dr. Ned Hallowell, and thank you for joining me on my podcast called Distraction. Today, we're talking about getting older, and more specifically, getting older and managing money. How do you know when you can no longer make good financial decisions? Wow, that's a tough question. It's like, how do you know when you're not able to drive any longer? Or if you have aging parents, how do you know when they need help before disaster strikes? You know, it's a very touchy subject. And, I mentioned driving. People are sensitive enough about driving, but the whole notion of becoming incompetent, to use a terribly fraught word, it's terrifying. I'm 67, and I was just talking to a friend yesterday. Are we losing it? I don't think we are, but to even broach that topic with yourself or with your parents or with anyone you love, it's a very, very difficult issue. And yet, it's incredibly important because people can get into tremendous trouble financially if they don't know what they're doing due to diminished capacity, And so we want this show to help you prevent that from happening to yourself, to your loved ones, to anyone you care about. So to give you an idea of what I'm talking about, a woman by the name of Hilary was kind enough to share her story with us. No, it's not Hillary Clinton. Her father was a smart, successful, independent investor who amassed a large amount of wealth, but unfortunately lost most of it while he was battling Alzheimer's, leaving Hillary's mother with next to nothing. Here's Hilary telling the story in her own words.
I'm Hilary, and I'm 52, and I'm a mother of 4, and I'm a daughter. And I'm now a daughter of 1, but I used to be a daughter of 2, a mother and a father. I'm telling a story that could happen to anyone. So the fascinating thing is this is a man in fabulous health, my father, with a slight irregular heartbeat that can easily be fixed through a pretty routine procedure by the best doctor, in the United States who does this thing. And a mistake was made, and there is human error everywhere. We're human, we're fallible. So the interesting thing is that this is nothing any of us could have seen coming down the pike, and the chances of it happening were 1 in 250,000. So had we even researched it, we wouldn't have been concerned. To make a long story short, what happened is he left the hospital after a week in intensive care, and he had a hole. There was still the hole in the back of his heart we didn't know about, and it was being blocked by a blood clot. So he looked and seemed okay leaving the hospital. But over the next 2 weeks, he got progressively more ill. My brother, who's a doctor, has a stethoscope at home and realized he was in really bad shape, and he had to go back to the hospital at Yale, New Haven, again with one of the best cardiologists in the world, and he had to have emergency open heart surgery. And what I'm saying about this is this was the second insult to the brain, resulting from the first, but he was unconscious again. And so these 2 insults to the brain that happened within 2 weeks of each other left him with 2 disease processes accelerated in his brain that probably wouldn't have happened until his 80s or 90s. And he didn't want any of us to know that he felt really insecure and anxious and unable to track things. So he was super good at covering it up. He was really smart. He had a fantastic vocabulary. And he was an independent investor, so he didn't have financial advisors. So he continued, and what we know now from reading his journals is what he did is not only did he continue investing, he tried to make a killing for his family. He sensed he was losing his mind. He was. And he didn't want us to know. And not only that, he wanted to provide for everybody in full color. But he was impaired, really impaired. So the investments he was making were terrible. And I actually don't think there was any fraud, but there could have been. We haven't been able to figure this out. It could have been that there was someone who seduced him on the internet to give a lot of money to a stupid thing. It's really hard to figure out because he was an independent investor. And the financial advisors I've worked with have said, this is the most difficult type of person and family to help. When you have a guy at the helm who's independent, he doesn't want help, he doesn't want intervention. And so by the time we figured out that he was losing his mind, he'd lost all his money. And he had a few assets home that we had to sell that are now my mother's fixed income is living off of the little that he had left, which we're lucky he had. Some people might have had nothing, but he had a house to sell. So, we have basically a pretty bad story. I mean, we have a great story in the sense that he was able to realize that he was in really big trouble, and he also was able to realize that he'd caused a catastrophe, which I feel terrible for him for having to realize that. But when he realized that, he told us he was taking an early exit, and he stopped eating and drinking intentionally, even though he was still quite strong, because I think he realized he would have been an expense and a liability to a degree that, there wasn't the money to cover. Financially, our story is not a good one, and that could have really been prevented.
So I think just about anyone can relate to that story and be scared by that story, be alarmed, be sort of a feeling of how do I prevent that from happening to me or my loved ones. So what do you do when you think your mom or dad or spouse or anyone is in trouble and maybe making disastrous financial decisions? How do you bring that up? What do you do next? Well, we have somebody here who can help. He can really, really help. In the studio with me now is my friend, my business partner. We go back a long way. His name is Chris Heye, Heye. And he founded a really cutting-edge, forward-thinking company called Cogniscent that is doing some really great things. But instead of me telling you about it, Chris, why don't you tell our listeners about your wonderful protocol and company?
Well, thanks, Ned, and thanks for inviting me to be on the podcast. So what I've been doing over the last couple of years or 3 years is try to develop some tools and some educational materials that help older adults make better financial decisions. So, as probably many of your listeners know, we're at a point in this country and many developed countries where we have an aging population. And that aging population also tends to have more money. So if you look at the statistics in the United States, depending how you measure it, but it's something like, 2/3, 3/4 of the wealth in this country is owned by people over 55 or 60. But then you look at the other statistics and you see that, dementia can set in as early as age 60. And that roughly it's the incidence of dementia doubles every 5 years starting at age 60. So you have this somewhat troublesome phenomenon where you have people who have the most amount of money that they'll ever have in their life at a time when they're increasingly less able to make good financial decisions. So what we did is we administered a random sample of people this full battery of cognitive tests, and then we also gave them sort of full battery of financial literacy and related questionnaires, and then another questionnaire which actually had some really interesting results was called the Monetary Choice Questionnaire, and this is one. It's like that fancy test where you give the second grader, you say, well, do you want one cookie now or do you want 2 cookies later? But anyway, sort of the bottom line from the study for me is that there's a bunch of issues, a bunch of sort of behavioral issues that people aren't really talking about now when they're talking about diminished capacity vis-a-vis financial decision-making. And so my favorite analogies that Dr. Tony Weiner uses, he calls it the Nana's meatballs problem. If Nana, I mean, I forget some term for grandmother.
Right.
But if Nana forgets how to make the meatballs that she's been making for 50 years and she can't make the meatballs anymore, that's a problem.
Yeah.
So, things that used to be second nature, like, getting lost driving to the grocery store, not being able to, follow a recipe anymore or remember a recipe. I mean, those are the kinds of things that
I think people can understand the problem. It's pretty clear. What are your companies doing to help?
We're increasingly compiling a nice set of education materials that we're making available to everybody. So if you go to wealthcareplan.com, there's some education materials that are free for everyone, including there's this checklist that we did with Mass General Hospital on identifying some of these behavioral signs.
Uh-huh.
The second thing we've done is we're putting together tools, and these are geared, at least at this point, for financial advisors. But one tool is a sort of an assessment that's based on the study that we did at MGH. So we asked people, how do you make decisions? Do you buy things late at night on TV, as seen on TV products? Have you experienced a personal loss recently? People who had that did worse. And so questions like that. And then there's some other kind of little cognitive-y questions, but it's a 10, 15-minute questionnaire. It's really geared towards capacity to make financial decisions. So it's the only assessment we know now it's really driven towards trying to understand financial decision-making. Another tool we have is what we call financial caretaking. It's another questionnaire that's designed to be done, before things go bad. So we're big believers in preventative actions. So it asks questions like, who's managing your finances now? Who's paying your bills? Who's investing? So there's a big drive now in the financial services industry to gather what's called trusted contact information. So this is, okay, Ned, you're over 55 or over 60. Something bad could happen tomorrow. We hopefully it won't happen for a long time, but something bad happens. Who's the person? It's almost like a financial healthcare proxy.
Mm-hmm. So who would the typical person be?
I think sort of the typical person would be someone, a baby boomer or really anybody sort of in their 50s or 60s who, especially someone who is looking after aging parents. I mean, that's kind of the most critical. There are a lot of people now really struggling with those types of issues.
And they would go and they'd get what are the tools again? The assessment tool?
There's assessment tool. There's what we call the financial caretaking tool. And then there'll be very soon the long-term care planning tool.
And they just download these for free?
Those right now are available to the financial advisor. So you would go to your financial advisor and say, hey, use these.
Comparable tools are not being used, correct?
There's nothing else like this. There's nothing else like this out there. And
that's kind of striking. So the average financial planner at Merrill Lynch or what have you doesn't have a desk-side way of assessing the mental status of his 80-year-old client or the 80-year-old father of his client.
Unfortunately not, and it's a problem. And the good news is there's association of state. It's kind of like state attorneys general, but it's the sort of the comptrollers, and they're now recommending that financial advisors do some sort of testing.
Because these people are babes in the woods. I mean, they're prime. It's a disaster waiting to happen. And the kids, it's very hard to talk to your father, and say, Dad, you're incompetent, or I'm worried about your competence, or please don't spend all your money before you die on these cockamamie schemes, the boat you just bought. I had a good friend who went through this. Now, you don't want to sound greedy, but at the same time, you don't want to see your parents just squander, just throw money out the window without really knowing what they're doing. And financial planners and doctors are both sort of – neither one has license to walk right into that. And so bringing them together with WealthCare Plan makes all the sense in the world.
I think it's really important. And I've heard financial advisors tell me saying we're on the front lines. Like we'll see this often before there's any official diagnosis,
right?
Because sometimes we have relationships, 10, 20 years relationship, and then finally our client comes in and you could, they're disheveled, they're irritable, they can't focus.
And the first signs were their finances deteriorating.
and then money's going out, and so it's difficult. I mean, the good news is that there's great awareness now. and they're things like gathering trusted contact information. I think there's more coming. There's more coming. There's some legislation in the Senate right now, but it's something that still the financial service firm are struggling with. I mean, there's estimates of they're up to $37 billion a year of money that just goes away
and growing fast, because us baby boomers, I'm 67, we're coming into prime time for Alzheimer's, as well as all kinds of other less dramatic conditions. And as you said, it's not just memory, but executive function that it gets impaired. I think
the executive function is worse because, it's also the governor, as you know, much better than I. That's the governor. That's what tells you don't buy that. Don't listen to that guy, that nice man who just called from Nigeria. The executive function tells you don't do that. But when that goes away, it seemed really nice.
And when you're sitting there alone, and you listen to a nice voice, your defenses are down. So gosh, these tools seem so important. And any financial planner can access them?
Anybody can access them. And we're just starting. There are some users now, and we've had a bunch of beta users go through this. And it was interesting, some of the comments, because they were not only that, this is helping me identify problems and planning, but they say things like, my client was so happy that we were talking about this stuff. I mean, a lot of these advisors are like, we're talking about death and aging and money. It's really hard. And the clients are coming back and saying, thank you.
Yeah.
I've been worried about this for a long time.
Yeah.
I'm so happy we're talking about this stuff. And I think that, so again, beyond just the quality of the tools, is this whole sort of relationship building, which, Ned, I think about your stuff a lot because it really helps the connection part.
Absolutely.
Most people, especially when you get older and you have money, you want to talk to a person.
Right.
You want to talk to a person. I mean, you want that person to be technology enabled, but you want somebody just saying, hey, I get it. This is what we're doing. We're going to be okay. And I think that our tools really help out in that area as well. I think they really help with that sort of relationship building component of the job.
So listeners should go to your financial advisor, say go to wealthcareplan.com and download these tools so that you can get an objective assessment of the mental state of you or your loved one, and allow that to guide whatever plans you make.
And there's additional planning tools. So again, we really focus on prevention. In a lot of other ways in your life, you prepare for things and for the worst case scenario. And this is another way to do it. It's just a little bit of insurance. There's really no reason not to do it. These assessments, these questionnaires take 15 minutes, 10, 15 minutes of your life.
And aside from worst case scenario, it just happens. Everybody ages, and executive function, not to mention the modern life induces problems. Everybody will come up against these, so it seems like it's a no-brainer, to deal with your brain, your aging brain, and your parents' aging brains, and make these plans. And all you have to do is just go to wealthcareplan.com. This is a great service, and it doesn't exist. It's amazing it doesn't exist.
It doesn't exist, and I think that, I think for a variety of reasons. One of it, again, is just this difficulty, putting these, you're putting money and death together in the same sentence in aging, and that's just a hard place to go.
Yeah, but it's also it's not hard. I think people maybe overdo how hard it is. It's not hard.
Okay.
What's hard is not going there. What's hard is dealing with it when you wish you had done it. And so, on the podcast, we really like to provide useful information. And boy, this is extremely useful information. I can't thank you enough.
Good to see you.
Wonderful to see you. Again, wealthcareplan.com. Then that's WHEALTH care, Wealthcare. Thanks so much, Chris.
Thanks, Ned.
Well, my thanks to Chris High for joining me in the studio today. This is just a tremendously important development. It's been written up in some of the financial journals, and this is really going to save people from themselves and from their, again, we don't like to use the words, but they are in play, diminished capacity, Alzheimer's, dementia, failing memory. All of that. You want to help protect someone from ruining themselves financially. I urge you to check out Chris's website And check out his website. And I also want to thank Hilary so much for sharing her father's story with us. It was very instructive and cautionary, to be sure. I'm sure it wasn't easy for her to talk about it, but she did it knowing that the story could help others avoid a similar situation. You know, this is the theme of the show, helping people look out for each other, trying to create this network of connection that I talk about all the time. How do we use the information, the technology, the science that we have to help one another, to provide not only information but emotional support, to band together and make the best out of the life we are all living together. All right, well, before I say goodbye, I have a favor to ask of you. Could you please take a moment and fill out our listener survey? We really need feedback from you all. We're trying to learn more about you, our listeners, and it would really help the show if you went to distractionpodcast.com and clicked on the blue words in the upper right-hand corner that say Take Listener Survey. It's very short, and we'd really appreciate it. I know you get asked this kind of stuff all the time, but we're a small little operation, and we really need your help to grow and to, tailor what we do to who you are and what you want and need. So please go to distractionpodcast.com, go to the upper right-hand corner and click on the blue words that say Take Listener Survey. Thank you so much. Distraction is produced by Collisions, the podcast division of CRN International. Collisions, podcasts for curious people. Our original music theme was created by Mark Berman. Our sound engineer is the incredibly skillful Scott Person. And our producer is the delightful and talented Sarah Gerton.